more minute while people are still joining the session. But what we're at achieving today is going through a practical deployment of Microsoft Purview. I'm Adriaan Bekker, Director of Microsoft Security Services at Softworks, and what we'll be doing during this session is covering how do you practically deploy. I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping. If for any reason I disappear, technical fault, I will endeavor to rejoin very quickly. Please be aware the session is being recorded and the recordings and slides will be made available afterwards. Any questions and answers or questions that you have, I will look to answer at the end of the session, but please feel free to start putting them through as we go through all of these subject matter today. The agenda for today is we'll cover off some of the latest news from Microsoft. Then we'll look at the practical deployment of Purview, and we'll look at 5 key areas, and we'll cover that off shortly. And finally, we'll go through some questions and answers. Now, for people who's not aware, this month is Cyber Awareness Month, so you would have seen quite a lot of communication going out from everybody around cyber awareness training, being aware of cyber scams, risks, and everything else. So please be aware of it, make your staff aware, and make sure you encourage them to take cybersecurity seriously. We've also had an announcement that Copilot Vision is coming. Effectively, what that will mean is Copilot in the Edge browser will understand what you are looking at and contextually help you find information. This could be like browsing for housing or browsing for articles, information. You have to actually turn that on in Edge, but please be aware of that. We've also had the announcement that Copilot for Excel is now in general availability. It's finally out of preview. It seems to have improved quite significantly over the when I looked at it last time. And as I said to people previously, I struggled with it, but it seems to be much more intuitive. So what I'll be interested in is go and try it for the people who's using Copilot for M365. Try it, see what you think, and get give me some feedback as we move along. Finally, the Digital Defense Report for 2024 has just been published. We will be looking to go through that next month in more detail because it makes for some really interesting reading regarding the number of attacks that's coming, the number of engagements, how much the UK is targeted, individual targeted, what type of compromises we've got to think about, and where we are from a security point of view. But we'll do an in-depth analysis of that next month. There is a couple of articles already out on LinkedIn, but we'll look more into the Digital Defense Report from 2024. Right, without further, let's get started on Microsoft Purview. Now, firstly, I would like to give a quick shout out to Ray Reyes from Microsoft, who has developed a guide for deploying Microsoft Purview. I follow him. He's done some excellent work and he provides very much practical experience, which I do go and borrow from regularly to help me in my day-to-day work. So thank you very much, Ray. Now, where we are from Microsoft Purview, it covers a significant number of subjects. And we've gone through in previous webinars regarding what's included, but just as a very quick overview, you've got your information protection, that's protecting data, highly confidential information. Data loss prevention prevents the loss of sensitive information. Thinking about how we deal with our data lifecycle, what's the information we got to retain, why do we got to retain it? Think about our insider risks regarding potential employees accidentally uploading documents or doing things that they're not supposed to. And then we mentioned communication compliance, where we've got to think about how we look at the day-to-day operation, for example, profanity, which is potentially business risks, or data risks, where people are looking for things that might be contradictory to what we want them to do. For example, insider trading, financial risk, fraud, etc. And then finally, we've got the eDiscovery feature to help us understand what information we have, discover that data, publish the data, or use it in litigation while we investigate certain circumstances. These are the main categories regarding Purview. Microsoft has also just launched, or have been launching, the new version of Purview. So if you haven't looked at it, purview.microsoft.com. It's very much similar to the previous Purview, but the new modern interface with a couple of name changes, new features that's in preview. So as we go through this, I've tried to incorporate the new name changes, but just to be for complete transparency, there might be still some references to the old terminology, as Microsoft keeps changing the wording between the old and the new version of Purview. Now, Purview, what is Purview? Purview is all about your data management, your data information. And what Purview can do is help you prevent data exfiltration outside your information, outside your organization, and keep your information safe. And what this is a quick example of is the information that is being tracked and that Purview can be used to help you with preventing data loss inside your information. So if we move through from the left to the right, you can very much govern your data, label documents, label file shares, label endpoint documents on workstations. Then we can apply our data loss policies to stop us from uploading data potentially to a cloud application. So for example, by leveraging Defender for Cloud Apps that's integrated into your Purview and your DLP session, but also start monitoring for insider risk, which again can be, what is Adriaan doing? He's downloaded 3 sensitive documents. He's now trying to upload it. Maybe we need to go and trigger a conditional access policy that blocks me from uploading further information into the cloud. And then because of I've now done something suspicious, we can activate a eDiscovery case or legal case to understand more regarding my actions, what information I've accessed, what information I have regarding sensitive information, communications I've done. And all of that can be moved into your Sentinel environment. So where you have services like Secure 365 from Softworks, where it will create security incidents that can then be escalated and understood to understand more. Is this an insider risk? Is it a potential breach of data left? But again, all of these systems are integrated. And then finally, right at the end, you can also map your data lifecycle. For example, it's a legal document that we had to keep for 7 years. After 7 years, delete the document, get rid of it because it's not needed. So for organizations, it helps you understand a bit better the data that you are managing. And finally, we've got communication compliance, where people might be searching for data inside Copilot or searches, customer complaints. But there's a number of areas we can configure in Purview. And as we said, this is a simple example of how you can use Purview to prevent filtration and where it all linked together. So let's start off. How do we go about deploying Purview inside your organization? Well, step one is always know your data. Understand what information you have. And this is probably the longest phase and also the most difficult phase for a lot of organizations. And this can typically take anything from 2 to 4 months to really understand the information that you have. The good news is there's tools to help you and there's processes to understand where the data is, but you've got to start thinking about, where do we contain data? It's easier where everything is just in Office 365, for example, but there might be areas like on-premise file service, other cloud services, other applications that you leverage. So it's really, you need to understand you have and what is important to you. The good news of tools we can use, we've got the Data Explorer, which is natively in Purview, which will help identify data that you already have that is potentially got personal identifiable information or sensitive information in there. And this could be things like full names, IP addresses, physical addresses, but it will give you an idea of where you have data inside your organization. You can also use the information scanner. And then finally, what people sometimes forget, go and speak to your own staff, go and speak to your key stakeholders. What information do they hold? Where do they store it? What do they use that information for? What type of personal identifiable information is in there, or corporate sensitive information? But that is very much absolutely critical for you to understand the data and the potential confidential data that you hold. And you can also use your own classifiers, your own trainers to identify the information, but you need to spend time and think about the information that you have and gather where that is stored. You can go and view it as well in the Activity Explorer, so which will help you understand how users are using the systems, how they're using the data on a day-to-day basis. For example, files being renamed, data being archived. Is there some sort of information being printed, files being copied, files being read? But what this will do is show you how data is being used on a day-to-day basis. File renames is quite significant in this example, or file created on removable media on one day was quite a high volume. Why is that the case? Is it something which will impact potentially our data loss prevention policies? But what information we have and how is it being used? Once you've done all of that, we need thinking about creating a taxonomy for classification. And this is a good example, as I mentioned, that Ray has created, which I found very easy to use and simple. But we need to think about what classifications and sensitivity we want to apply when we start encrypting data. What type of permissions do we want? Do we want it to be encrypted or not encrypted? Do we just want it to be labeled? Is there permissions that we're going to auto-assign, or is it we're going to leave it up to the user to classify these documents? If we auto-label it, what is the standard that we want to label documents to by default? What other features do we want to include, like watermarks, for example? Because once we create a watermark, this cannot be removed. This will be in the background of every one of our documents, which will help us understand, again, regarding data loss prevention, securing our confidential information. And then finally, who do we need to publish this information to? Is it going to be certain departments? And you might have labels that differentiate based on job role, departments, what type of information you have. And a good category that I also include is personal. Why not classify personal? So when a user leaves and you need to transfer their mailbox to somebody else, you can remove all of the personal information that they send in there, but they can classify it as personal. For example, mailing their doctor. We shouldn't use our work email for personal reasons, but let's be honest, on a day-to-day practical point of view, we do use it. Or I get asked by HR to send through my ID document. That can be marked as personal to show that it contains personal information. But think about the categories. Think about what is your impact on your business. What is right for you regarding a taxonomy for classification? And try and keep it simple. Too many labels will make it difficult, but you also may need to ensure there's enough classification to deal with all of your legal requirement, your data retention policies, and what will work for your organization. So let's start getting into how do we start with adopting Purview inside our organization. Well, crawl, walk, run, the three phases, and you'll hear me mention this regularly. So initially, we need to create a small proof of concept, map out what we want to achieve and how it's going to work. Go and draw your business process, how that's going to flow, what's the impact going to be on each of the individuals, because unless you draw out these flows, you are going to be missing certain scenarios. You are potentially going to impact your business in ways that you didn't think. What I normally suggest is create this information, map it out, and then publish these rules to a small team. And this is normally your IT team or the team that's going to be responsible for implementing it with your key stakeholders. Test the user experience in each of these areas, especially where you're going to use mandatory labeling. Test it, make sure that you understand what the impact is. Think about the scenarios that you're going to have when you publish these labels. For example, I'm about to mail the piece of information to external key stakeholder. If we classify it as highly confidential, can't be opened by external stakeholders, what's the process for us to get that declassified or changing the label on that particular engagement? Think about these scenarios, because what we don't want is creating process, procedure, and labeling that's also going to disrupt the business. So make sure you test all of the scenarios. Set up some external dummy users to understand what their experience is going to be. Because internally it might work, but the moment your staff, as I mentioned, share the data with somebody outside or with the public or general where they have to engage with, it might mean they are unable to access the data. But from a point of view, think about how that is done. Think about who's got permissions to reclassify information, and think about where it is. Map that out. And this is what I normally call the crawl phase in the part. The next is the walk phase. What we want to do here is start rolling out the labels to key business stakeholders so we can understand what's the actual impact in each of the departments regarding the new system we're using. And that will be very limited to a number of key users, understand as well how they're using it. And for that, we can get the feedback from the end users directly. Well, this worked, this didn't work, especially if you start auto-labeling certain small libraries, for example. Understand the feedback from those stakeholders and incorporate that. Go and look at the Activity Explorer to understand how many times labels have been applied, how many times labels have changed, especially where you turn on auto-labeling, targeting maybe one or two users or each of the key business stakeholders. You'll be able to see how often their documents are being classified or labels changed or labels removed. But again, you'll get a feeling of what is happening on that. Think about as well how we're going to use auto-labeling as we move forward. Where do we want to apply it based on what information, and map that out. Discuss that with the business stakeholders. Because although Purview is a technical implementation, it very much belongs to the business owners, the key stakeholders, because yes, we want to protect the data. We want to make sure we keep it secure, compliant, to meet all of our legal and obligations. But you do got to have the business buy-in and the business stakeholders as part of this process. Once you've received the feedback, once you've monitored that, you can then create your final plan of how we're going to deploy this throughout our whole organization. How are we going to go live with all of this to our stakeholders throughout the organization? Then go live, and the run phase is we are now up and running across for organizations, or as I've seen some IT managers, they physically run away because of the number of questions they get. But now that we're going live, think about, we're about to send this live to everybody. There will be a significant increase potentially in communications disruption while users gets used to the new way of working, the new labels that's being applied, and the impact that we have. But because we've now activated the information protection, all users will give it. There's some areas that I do want to mention. Publish all the labels to the users 24 to 48 hours before you're about to go live, as it takes some time for the new changes to push out to everybody. Think about sending out communications to everybody, explaining very clearly what they are doing, why we're having it in place, and how you expect them to use. Also be sure that the label description that you've put as part of your labels is very clear, so the user can very easily understand why something is marked as confidential, or what do we expect them to be marking information as confidential if you are doing manual labeling. And finally, think about creating a guide for your users, because you're going to have new people joining. You're going to have people getting used to the changes. So make sure you get that guide in place. Make sure that's communicated, and keep training the users. And as part of this, make sure you do have your detailed final plan. It's not just the fact of let's turn it off, on, and hope. there's got to be a plan. There's got to be thinking about what the implication is, because once labels is applied, they're applied. It will take a lot of time to roll back. So plan is going to be my message. Think about it, test it, and then we can start moving forward with the next stages. In parallel, you could implement DLP, and I'll start talking about some of the other areas that you can run in parallel or sequential. It's up to you as an organization how much you want to take on. But the classification, the encryption of information is one of the biggest impact we see inside the organization, because if you get it wrong, it will fail and it will cause significant disruption to the organization. Now, as I mentioned, you can also do data loss prevention in parallel, or you can do it afterwards. Data loss prevention is there to help protect the information from being lost, or sensitive information getting outside of your organization that you don't want to. And again, follow the same principle: crawl, walk, run. Think about, do I leverage the sensitivity labels that I have, or are we going to be putting in new labels, for example, for data loss prevention? My view is, let's leverage the sensitivity labels that we've already implemented and plan to implement it in parallel. Because from a point of view, having your data loss prevention in place makes sense. We are about to label all this information. We then wanted to prevent it from leaking outside our organization. So think about it. You don't necessarily have to turn on DLP, but at least you'll start seeing which of these policies would be caught by data loss prevention by leveraging the rules inside the organization. And as I said, we can leverage sensitivity labels or retention labels during this process. Bringing us back to the taxonomy, where you've got to think about what rules do we want to implement with those documents. Do we want the data loss prevention? Does it make sense on the labels that we've implemented for data loss prevention? Now, with DLP, we can go and view Explorer again, understanding what would have happened, what would have created some of those activity around that. And that could be, for example, will there be DLP rule matching? Has data been copied, potentially that's sensitivity outside the organization? And you can start understanding what data loss prevention will capture, what type of events we will see inside the organization, and it will impact our users. Once you've gone through that, again, map out these business processes and policies of what you're trying to achieve, build it, and test the conditions. There is a simulation mode inside the new Purview. It used to be called test mode previously. Turn it on. Have simulation mode. That means that the users won't be impacted, but you'll get a view of how the DLP policies will behave based on the information that it's detected, based on the labeling, based on the rules that you want to implement. And start thinking about, is it being triggered for each of the areas that you have? For example, data being shared via OneDrive, data being shared via SharePoint, Exchange, Teams. What happens when I'm uploading it? What happens if I send that outside my organization? Think about what happens when I copy it to USB drive. Go and map all of the scenarios that might apply to your organizations, and then look at then deliberately try and breach those to make sure that the policies you've implemented will trigger in the data loss prevention. But also think about, if you want to enable data loss prevention on the endpoint, the devices need to be onboarded to Defender for Endpoint in the XDR console as well. So has the DLP policies, has the devices been onboarded? Then go and publish your policies and make sure that these are deployed not just to your endpoints, but across your organization. And once you want to go live, turn off your simulation mode so that policies will be activated. Review your activity with the Activity Explorer. Look at the alerts that's being generated. Where are those alerts coming through? Are we getting excessive number of alerts? Have we missed certain behavior? Go and retweak these DLP policies. It's not a one policy fits all. think about the scenarios. There might be special scenarios that you got to entertain inside your organization, or DLP policies that needs to be changed for a specific department. And then be aware as well, you can leverage DLP or adaptive DLP with your insider risk management. And this comes back to all of these services are linked. With adaptive DLP, could be that look at what Adriaan is doing. He's downloading sensitive information. Okay, that's a potential insider risk. Maybe activate a policy that will now prevent me from uploading any information to any cloud application while you investigate why I've downloaded 30 or 50 sensitive documents as part of our DLP policies. But there's a lot of these areas you've got to think and consider before you go live. So in summary, test before you turn it on. Make sure you map out all of the processes, what you want to cover during the engagement. That is DLP. The next part we're looking at, which I get asked for, is, well, we need to manage our data and we need to manage records. Again, this is an area that is not being utilized as much by organizations as they should be. From my view is, think about what is your regulatory requirements. Think about what you want to do regarding retention. So we've got classification, but you can also have your retention labels in place. With the retention, the whole idea is to keep the data for X number of years before it's being disposed of. You want to think, what are the documents? What type of information do we need to retain? How long do we need to retain it? What's the process? Think about what happens with mailboxes. What happens with OneDrive? You got to think about how we're going to do it. So the whole idea of data lifecycle management is to retain the data. Then once it's past its retention period, delete it and get rid of it, dispose of it. I do get a lot of nervousness against the permanent deletion of data. Well, we don't quite know what the process is. Think about your disposition. There is a disposition area, and you can set the record retention that says, move it to disposition. Trigger somebody to review that information before we go ahead and just delete the data inside the organization. But again, you can automate the process that says, dispose the data, look through the disposition. If it's not been actioned, then permanently delete 30 days, for example. Now, with data cycle management, labeling retention is relatively easy to implement. It's more about the governance and what needs to be done. So what we've got here is an idea of what you should be doing effectively. What daily activity you have regarding label applications? What retention labels are being set on a daily basis? Is it still relevant? Is it correct? Is it what you expected? Review these retention activities. Review what activities you have. And then on a weekly basis, go and review the dispositions. It depends on the size of the organization, if that's weekly, monthly. But what you have in your dispositions is the data that's now scheduled for deletion. And I think for users, they do struggle with this whole idea of reviewing. Well, we don't have time. We don't understand it. We're worried about what we have. Start the process. Get used to it, because I think the longer you leave it, the worse the problem gets. And if you think about it, it's a bit like moving house or clearing out house. When you move, you don't know what or what equipment you have inside the house. You want to have a big clear out. Have a big clear out, and when you move into the new area or new house, you're able to put in the documents. You can manage the stuff you have in the right place, make it easy to find, and know how long you want to keep it and when you want to get rid of it. This is a big exercise to start with, and I get that for organizations it can feel daunting, but once you've put it in place, it becomes easier and also helps you with discovery, eDiscovery, as we're going to talk about, helps you with only retaining that's relevant to your organization. For companies who are starting to use Copilot, it means that old data is not coming to the fore because it's been disposed of. And that's what you've got to think about. Yes, it's hard work, but from a data management point of view, this is what's going to change and optimize the organization. Now, with retention labels and retention policies, there's a couple of key differences. Retention policies are normally set on a SharePoint site group. It's automatic, and it is set normally at the mailbox level or at a specific SharePoint site. The retention period as well is calculated from when the document is created or modified. That's one key area that I do want to highlight, because some people get caught out, especially if you set a retention policy new library with existing documents. Well, it didn't keep it for 7 years. Well, it's based on when the document was created or modified. So that's a catch that I just wanted to highlight as well. And then from a regulatory point of view, retention policies, preservation locks are automatically applied. Administrators cannot delete it. Now, with retention labels are normally set at an item level or specific level, and that can be done on individuals. For example, I've had an email through, we don't have automatic retention policy set on my mailbox, and I want to, but this is a very pertinent email or pertinent document, and I want to manually set a retention label. I can set those retention label. That period that it will do by setting it manually starts from when you applied the label. And that's one key difference between a policy and a retention label where I set it myself, is that the one is based on when the document was created, the other one is based on when the label was applied. Again, be aware of it, have it in place, don't get caught out. Now, we also talk about insider risk, and this is an area where organizations think about it, they like the idea of it, but again, feels a bit daunting because it's not really a technical implementation. That's the easy part. It's more to do with HR and legal and management that needs to decide what do they want to class as insider risk. And the few things I want to highlight is 25% of all breaches are actually insider risk activities. It normally involves some key stakeholders, and you got to have your key stakeholders involved. This is not an IT decision. This is not an IT implementation. This is very much driven via the HR, legal, and management. And you need to understand what those potential policy impacts are going to be. And again, think about the whole crawl, walk, run approach. Start with key individuals. Think about what do we want to monitor with these areas. Is it business conduct, or is it regulatory conduct? What are we trying to do? Do we really want to know that, I don't know, somebody used a swear word in Teams, inappropriate language? You might get thousands of those. I don't know what the culture is. You don't know what the communications are. But if you are monitoring it, why are you monitoring it? For what business? Or are we looking at regulatory conduct, for example, money laundering, potential money laundering? Think about who's going to have access to those data. Create the policies that you want to monitor. Start where those alerts are going to go to. And I think the numerous alerts that will be generated is normally what catches out the people. So what I say is send it to one area, get a view of how many alerts would have been generated before you turn the policy live, and run the reports regarding these policies, so you can get a very much a clear understanding of what you're about to embark on. For a number of the organizations, they like the idea of communication compliance. They like the idea of turning it on. But again, we're seeing it is such a big impact. There's so much legal and HR pitfalls. You've got to think very carefully why we're doing it. Is it to as I said, is it just to help us with our business, or is it regulatory requirements? And if it's regulatory, that's got to be clearly defined, clearly notified, and a process needs to be documented on how you want to bring that in place. Now, where we end up with in the final areas of the practical area part of deploying Purview is to help us in the end with our eDiscovery. And I think this is still the area where I see a lot of confusion, a lot of input, a lot of, well, what do we want to discover? What information are we having? Because we've just done all of this label activities, we've done all of the information with the retention that we talked about, practically implementing it. It all comes down to the end, what information do we have? And there's a few ways when we start being asked for information is, do we just want to understand what information is being held so we can do some information discovery inside the organization? But what companies normally want is to need to investigate a case, for example. There might be a legal requirement, a potential insider risk that we want to investigate, a legal case, a customer complaint, or all of the above, or a subject access request that you have in place. You got to think about, what am I using? Am I using the right tool? If it's a subject access request, well, why will I use eDiscovery with advanced lock? I probably just want to go and run the information. If I am going to run a eDiscovery, what information do I want to get back and why do I want to have that? With Microsoft has now launched a new eDiscovery Purview, which make it a little bit easier, much better interface, will help significantly with it. But if we run through eDiscovery and advanced eDiscovery, few things that I want to highlight. If you're using advanced eDiscovery, you've got to license all users, just to be clear, because people keep trying to license one and then search everybody's data. Everybody who can benefit from advanced eDiscovery needs to be licensed. So that's the one bit I just wanted to highlight. Now, with eDiscovery and advanced eDiscovery, we wanted to go through a couple of processes. We want to think about who's going to be responsible for it. Yes, IT gives out the technical access. They might run even the initial eDiscovery, or do we want to hand that over to legal and HR? Go and map out the process and responsibilities inside your organization regarding who's responsible for eDiscovery. What type of questions do we normally get asked? Who needs to have access to it? So give access to the right teams. Is it just to run a big blunt identification, collect the data and then remove it, or put a legal hold on it? Or does it need further in-depth review regarding the information that's being done? Because you've got to think about the amount of information you're potentially going to get back, the potential information that's going to be disclosed. You have an obligation to remove data that's potentially legally sensitive or don't need to be disclosed. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not the legal person or HR that knows what is allowed to be handed over and what may not be. So you got to think about that. I also think about, start simple. Keep it very simple when you engage with eDiscovery. Train the users who will be using it and try and make it a lot simpler, the process. And then think about preservation. Every eDiscovery case that you run, you can tick preservation, which will go and lock the data. If you haven't done that correctly, that data or that case completed, that information is going to get held indefinitely. Think about it. Although you got all of the labels applied that we talked about earlier for data retention, to delete it, if you've got a discovery that's ongoing, that data gets legally held and for review until you finish it and export the data and then complete the case when that preservation will be released. It's one of those areas that you've got to think about. What is the potential impact by the information we have? So if you start a very broad search and don't reduce it, you might end up holding most of your organization data or email by accident without understanding why it's never being released or why it's never being cleaned up. So think about that. The other catch that we normally see is the SharePoint recycle bin. Once data has been deleted into the SharePoint recycle bin, it does not get flagged up in eDiscovery. It's one of those areas you've got to think about. If we want to go back, you had a user, mailbox is being preserved, but deleted their OneDrive. I suddenly get asked for a question within the last 30 days. Can you quickly run a discovery? It's too late. The mailbox is in the recycle bin. The Dropbox is in the recycle bin. It's not been removed, but from a point of view, I won't be able to discover that data until you bring it back into life. So it's be aware of the quirks of eDiscovery. Be aware where there's potential gaps that you haven't considered or processes. But map that out, map out the engagement, think about who we're going to have in place. At the bottom of the screen, there's a simple workflow, which is basically, which we say follow. Identify your data, set up your preserve, notify the people whose messages you're holding, collect, process the data, review the data that you're going to have in place, and then finally export the data to whoever you need to give it, for example, over to the barristers or any particular case you have to place. And once you get the feedback, go and release it, complete the case so all the preservations are removed. I'm conscious that was a whistle-stop tour on practically implementing Purview inside the organization. And I think in summary, what I just want to say to people is don't rush it. Follow the crawl, walk, run approach. Think about it. Take your time. Technically, it's easy to turn on the boxes and get it and publish the labels. That's the easy part. It is more the planning, the rollout, the processes, how it's going to impact users. And especially now that we've got Copilot and a number of other areas, think about how that potentially impacts an area. When you're deploying all the Purview features, use the phage browsed where applicable, or if you're confident, go in parallel. As I mentioned, data loss prevention while you set up policies makes sense. If you're going to be leveraging retention labels, look at how it's going to affect you. But it takes time. It is not rushed. It's typically a 2, 6, 12-month project to get from beginning to end. I've seen it too many times where people think we can just do it quickly. There is no such thing as quickly when it comes to data. You've got to think about how you plan it. Thank you very much for joining me today. So I'm going to open up the floor to questions. So please feel free to ask questions, and I apologize while I look to my left to read some of the questions that's coming through. Sample, brilliant. Any thought or guide on how you might be able to use if your retention requirements are aligned to life cycle of the client rather than the life cycle of the document? That's very interesting. Life cycle management, you could potentially create a retention policy on a specific library for the client. I don't know enough about your business, but if you think about it, if you set a retention policy on a library and that retention policy will move with that document, you can have that match the customer. And the question then becomes, do most customers require the same retention policy, or is this a specific retention policy for that customer? And I think that's what you've got to look at. What are your requirements across your whole organization? Because if a majority of your customers require you to hold it for 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, I'm making up some numbers, then maybe that's a retention policy to apply. But if it's a specific one-off customer that requires you to keep it for 20 years, then what you want to think about is, do I go and create a policy just for that one customer for that retention? What I would try and do is agree a standard with customers when you engage for how long you've got to retain the data and do the data lifecycle management within their project or while working with them. That would be easier, but there's not a simple approach. It is very much, what is the requirements? Do we have a policy already that's relatively close that we can apply? For example, I don't know, customer says keep it for 5 years, we keep it for 7 years. Is that acceptable for the extra 2 years? Or no, we do need to enforce a 5-year retention. I hope that helps. I know it's not a correct answer, a full transparent answer, but it's a little bit, what are the requirements? How much other retention policies do you have? Because the last thing you want to do is end up with hundreds of retention policies. You want to try and create broad categories that can be applied and not have too many different ones. What license is required for connecting to external data boxes? Is there a difference with license from automatic versus manual? Yes, so with external repositories, M365 E5 for Purview normally covers most of these areas. There is some requirements regarding connections and volume. I'll need to look that up. They keep changing that data, if I'm very honest with you. I'll refresh it, but not for automatic classifications, you need the M365 E5 classification or license that includes the automatic. For manual, is anything very much lower than that from a point of view. Business premium, Scott data classification in to it from a point of view. But for automatic classification, normally the compliance module is needed with M365 E5 to have in place. Hope that answers that question. If not, I'm happy to do a more depth license call from a point of view. How resource intensive do you see the management of labeling and DLP being on an ongoing basis? I think what I said in the beginning is there's weekly, monthly tasks to review the policies. The DLP policies, once it's implemented, creating alerts into the environment and they enforcing the rules, I don't see that as very much that resource intensive, provided you've mapped out all of the resources and the processes that you wanted to map out and the different attack surface. What you do want to do on an ongoing basis is review the potential insider risk or data that is going outside the organization. Review on a monthly basis what type of labels are leaving the organization, what type of documents are leaving with what labels in place. Is there any gaps that you identify potentially regarding DLP? That area, I don't see that much from a point of view. And regarding the labeling, as long as the documents are being labeled automatically, as we mentioned, go look at the activity explorer, understand how many labels are being used and automatically labeled. And then think about how many support incidents you get regarding requesting labels to be declassified or labels to be reduced. I think where it does get interesting is where you start using data for your data lifecycle management, retention labels, for example, and labeling for data lifecycle. That is an ongoing weekly basis or monthly exercise to verify what is the information that you are disposing of. Is there any data that's accidentally being labeled that you are disposing of? For some organizations, they are happy just to let it go. And you know what? We'll put it in the disposition for a month, or I think the maximum you can do is 365 days, and then we will get rid of it. But for other organizations, they want to be very clear. We want to go through the data. We want to understand if we need to reclassify it, restart it from the process, reapply the label, or move it to a different location because it's incorrectly being disposed of. It really depends on how much of this information you have, what's the impact of you potentially losing that old data to your organization. But if we're coming back to just specific the question, data loss prevention, retention, once it's implemented, once you've done the planning, the data loss prevention and the automatic labeling, setting that up, the impact is relatively low once you get it right. Where you're going to spend the time is the testing, mapping the scenarios, verifying that it's working like you intended before going live with everybody. Hopefully that helps, and I think that was from Will, so that's great. I'm just going to see if there's any other questions popping up at the moment, because last time I missed one or two, so I apologize for during the last event. No, I think those are no more questions that's come in. Perfect. I don't think I've seen any more questions. Well, you got my contact details. Feel free to reach out to me. We are going to do a workshop on the 27th of November where we will be going through the digital defense report. Spoiler alert. We will be looking through some of the statistics that we've seen over the last few over the last 12 months, but things, for example, we've seen password attacks move up from 4,000 to 7,000 per second, for example, business email compromise, nation state actors. But we'll spend some time to go through some of the statistics that's come through. And I've just been notified one last question has flashed up, so I'll try and see many companies adopting and utilizing label-driven encryption for individual documents, highly confidential. I have seen that being implemented quite a bit, but it's normally for really carefully thought of where they want to implement that from a point of view. It's not what I strongly recommend, don't go and encrypt every single document you have. Where it's really sensitive, the encryption really prevents that insider risk, documents potentially being leaked outside the organization. So where it's highly sensitive information that is being taken off site or is maybe taken home by a user, we have seen organizations implementing it. The encryption is great for your sensitive, but what I always say is try and keep that to a minimum wherever possible. But organizations do that on an ongoing basis, where they want to encrypt data because data is being moved outside their organization on USB sticks, for example, being taken home, where they allow people to access documents from home. Again, it depends on your setup, the scenarios. For example, if you're only going to allow me to access documents on my corporate laptop, corporate devices, we've got the data loss prevention in place. We've got the right declassifying of changing labeling of documents. There's the argument that you don't need to encrypt it. So we normally try and base it on the scenario-based engagement. But yes, I've had organizations encrypt everything, and that's a disaster, to be blunt about it, because it's so much overhead when you want to send data out. But encrypting your most sensitive information, where you've got the controls, where you want to make sure that if a person leaves, you want to revoke their access to that information, that's where it makes sense. So yes, we do see it, but I normally see it in specific scenarios where we've thought it out. Where I do see it where people just encrypt everything, it's not a great idea, my personal opinion, and I'm going to again say that's my opinion. There might be scenarios where you want to encrypt everything, but I rather label and change the labeling and leverage your data loss prevention and think about how people can access data inside our organization. For example, don't allow your home computers, don't allow personal devices. But where a document might be traveling to a user or everything else, you can encrypt it, and that access will move with that document. It can't be opened, and if that person leaves, they lose access to that document. Hopefully that answers the question on label-driven encryption on the individual documents. Perfect. I think that's all the questions, but as I said, feel free to reach out to me. More than happy. I'm on LinkedIn. You got my email address. It's been published, I think, by Phoebe. Look at the next event that we're going to be running. And if you want have a deeper conversation, please feel free to reach out. Thank you very much, everyone. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.